A black woman walked into a luxury bridal salon for a dream fitting, and walked out shamed and dismissed. What the salon didn't know: that bride carries the bloodline of Big Shaq. What began as exclusion became an expose. And by the time the truth surfaced, the world was watching. Because when legacy walks in unannounced, even silence has consequences. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun was gentle that morning in Beverly Hills, pouring gold over storefronts, lined with glass, marble and silence. Cars whispered like secrets, and every step on the sidewalk echoed against the curated perfection of the city. Between tall hedges and polished windows stood Maison Lune, the kind of place that didn't just sell gowns, it sold approval. It stood like a museum of femininity and status, where lace whispered legacy and satin shimmered with wealth. Avery stepped out of the rideshare in a flowing ivory blouse, heels steady, hair twisted into a clean, understated bun. Her skin glowed with melanin kissed by the sun, and her eyes carried the mix of nerves and giddy anticipation that only bridal stores could awaken. She clutched a small leather folder in her hand, a planner, a vision board, swatches of colors and images of the life she'd longed for since girlhood. No one escorted her. No one was filming this moment. No one, just a woman in love, on a solo mission to find the dress she would wear when she walked into forever. Inside Maison Lune, the atmosphere was hushed, sterile and scented with something too expensive to be named. The ceilings were high, the chandeliers like waterfalls of glass. Every inch of the place whispered exclusivity. At the reception desk stood a pale woman with a tight chignon and a tighter smile, flipping through a digital tablet. Her name tag read Renata. Avery stepped forward, breath light in her chest, ready to speak, but Renata had already seen her and made a silent calculation. Without looking up fully, she asked, "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," Avery smiled. "Under Avery. I emailed last week and got confirmation for today at 11. Renata scanned her tablet, finger scrolling slowly. Something in her face shifted, almost imperceptibly, but real. A tightening around the eyes. Her lips parted, then closed again. "I'm sorry," she said flatly. "I don't see your name here." "I have the email confirmation," Avery offered, opening her folder, carefully avoiding any edge of irritation. She'd learned long ago that women like her were granted less room to err. Renata glanced at the page, then handed it back without reading. "Unfortunately, we're fully booked today. Even with confirmation, we can't accommodate walk-ins. It's policy." Avery's smile didn't falter, but her heart stuttered. She was about to respond when another associate, younger and watching from the far counter, whispered something to Renata. The whisper was not loud, but Avery caught the glance, the tone, the kind used in department stores and cocktail parties to signal someone didn't belong. The glance that said wrong category without a word. Renata's tone shifted from polite to polished dismissal. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. Our clients expect a private, curated experience. You're welcome to reach out again through our standard process." For a second, Avery stood still, the weight of the moment heavier than expected. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just the quiet humiliation of being unwelcome, of being presumed misplaced, of being told in elegant words that her presence interrupted the aesthetic of wealth. No one in the salon said a word. No bride, no assistant, no manager came forward. They just watched, eyes darting then averting, silent bystanders to an exclusion made palatable by practiced smiles. Avery closed her folder. Gently, she looked up at the chandelier above, as if hoping for some clarity to rain down. Nothing came. "Understood," she said quietly. "I'll follow up later." She walked out with her back straight, heels steady. But the warmth in her chest had dimmed. On the sidewalk, under the same sun that had welcomed her, she paused, trying to decide whether to laugh or cry. She did neither. Instead, she walked. She didn't call her fiancé. She didn't post about it. She simply disappeared into the rhythm of the city. What Avery didn't know, what no one in Maison Lune could have imagined, was that her last name, if spoken aloud, would have stopped time. She didn't even carry it. She had never known it. Not from the birth certificate. Not from her mother, who had passed when Avery was 19. Jenna Caldwell had raised her daughter alone, strong and silent about the past. The name on Avery's ID was Caldwell. No hyphen, no addition, and no explanation ever given. What Jenna took to her grave was a truth no one had guessed. That Avery was the child of a man known to the world as Shaquille O'Neal. A name echoed in stadiums and carved into the legacy of American sports. A name heavy with fame, fortune, and contradiction. A name Avery didn't know was part of her own blood. That afternoon, as the internet buzzed over bridal trends and celebrity divorces, a quiet video uploaded by a tourist at Maison Lune began to circulate. In it, Avery's form was blurred in the background, but Renata's words rang clear. A faint voice. "She's probably just here for pictures. We've had people try that before." Another voice laughed. "This isn't Macy's." Within hours, the video was on a small blog, then Twitter, then a YouTube reaction channel. People debated whether it was racism or misunderstanding. Some said it was overblown. Others recognized it immediately. The casual, systemic rejection cloaked in polite language and corporate policy. In Georgia, on a quiet property framed by trees and sunlight, Big Shaq was making coffee when Lennox, his longtime assistant, called him into the study. On the screen, the video played. At first, Shaq squinted. Then he leaned closer. He stared, paused, rewound, watched again. Something moved behind his eyes. Something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Not since Jenna left without goodbye. Not since the silence that followed, and the rumors he chose not to chase. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. Then he spoke. "That woman," he said slowly, "looks just like Jenna." Lennox hesitated. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Shaq nodded once. A heavy, deliberate motion. "I need to know her name." The Georgia sun didn't scream like it did in Los Angeles. It hummed. It poured over Shaquille O'Neal's ranch like molasses, soft and golden, coating the wide fields and long stretches of gravel driveway that carved a path through the trees. The place was humble by his old standards. No basketball courts, no towering ceilings, just a single-story lodge wrapped in wraparound porches and the quiet kind of wealth that doesn't try to prove anything. It was here, far from endorsements and arenas, that Shaq had made a life for himself after the lights dimmed. A life that didn't need to be on display. Most mornings started the same. A jog along the southern trail, then coffee in a tin mug on the back deck. He'd watch the mist burn off the trees, while jazz played low from the vintage speakers he refused to replace. It was routine, and Shaq liked routine. It gave him time to forget the noise that used to follow him everywhere. But this morning wasn't routine. Inside, at the heavy oak table he used as a desk, his assistant Lennox hovered by the laptop, phone in hand, eyes locked on the screen. Lennox, ever the composed professional, rarely showed emotion. Today, though, there was something tight in his jaw. "Shaq," he called over his shoulder, not looking up. "You need to see this." Shaq stepped inside, towel draped over his shoulder, still catching his breath from the run. He leaned in without much interest at first. There were always clips, people saying his name, using it for jokes, for praise, for drama. He'd learned to tune it out. The video was grainy, probably phone footage. Inside a high-end store bridal, from the look of it. The camera wasn't focused on anyone in particular, just caught the moment in the background. A woman, black poised, standing still as ice water, while a sales associate waved her off. The audio was faint, but the words cut through. "We're fully booked. We can't accommodate you without a name on the list." There was something in the way the woman didn't flinch. She didn't push back, didn't plead. She simply collected herself and walked away. It wasn't weakness. It was the kind of strength people misread. A quiet steel that's been forged in fire too many times. Shaq froze. He leaned in closer. "Play that again," he said. Lennox didn't speak. He just hit replay. Shaq watched, slower now. This time, he looked past the incident, past the injustice, the coded language, the performative politeness. He focused on her eyes, her jawline, the way she carried herself. Something in his gut twisted. A weight that hadn't settled there in years. A familiarity that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. "Who is she?" he asked, voice low. Lennox scrolled through the video caption. "Names not listed. It's going viral without much context. Some think it's staged. Others are calling out racism. No one seems to know who she is." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Zoom in. You won't get much more detail from this resolution. Just do it." Lennox complied, enlarging the still where the woman turned slightly toward the door before leaving. Shaq stepped closer to the screen, arms folded. The shape of her face, the quiet power in her posture, The composure under humiliation, his breath caught in his throat, not from recognition but from memory. "Jenna," he murmured. Lennox glanced up. "Jenna?" Shaq nodded slowly. "She looks like Jenna Caldwell." Lennox's brows raised, uncertain. "You mean, from Columbia?" "That was what?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He dropped into the leather chair beside the desk, staring out the window as if the trees could rewind time. Jenna, he hadn't said that name out loud in years. She wasn't a tabloid romance. She was real, raw, quiet, brilliant. A woman who'd met him not as a celebrity, but as a man, back before the world told him who he was supposed to be. They'd met at a charity gala. She was there for a law scholarship fundraiser. He was there because his agent told him it was good PR. And yet they connected. A few late-night phone calls turned into something more. She never cared about the game, the fame, the cameras. She challenged him, made him feel human. Then she vanished. No confrontation, no drama, just silence. He'd looked for her lightly. Nothing public. Pride had its own set of rules back then. But she was gone. Moved cities, changed numbers. That part of his life closed without closure. Until now. "You think she's related?" Lennox asked cautiously. Shaq didn't move. "She has Jenna's eyes." Lennox sat down across from him. "We can dig. Quietly. I'll pull some contacts. Run facial match software. Social media trails. If she's anyone with a digital footprint, we'll find her." Shaq shook his head slowly. "I don't want a spotlight on her. Not unless we know. And if she is..." Shaq leaned back in the chair, eyes still locked on the screen. "If she is," he said slowly, "then I have a daughter who just got kicked out of a place for not fitting the look." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with unsaid things. Guilt, curiosity, dread, hope. Shaq had built empires. He'd rebuilt himself more than once. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the possibility that someone had inherited not his fame, not his fortune, but his silence. The very thing he had used to survive might have become someone else's burden. Outside, the trees swayed gently, unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted. In the stillness of that Georgia morning, a name whispered through the room, not spoken aloud, but felt deep in the marrow of a man who thought he'd buried that chapter forever. Jenna. And now. Possibly, Avery. The past, when it returns, doesn't knock. It slips in uninvited, riding on the back of a scent, a sound, a face you weren't prepared to remember. For Shaquille O'Neal, the past arrived in a dust-covered shoebox wedged behind an old trophy case in his storage shed. Lennox had been sorting through crates of memorabilia for a planned youth center gallery. Jerseys, clippings, signed shoes, things that once defined a life now boxed away, half forgotten, until he found the box marked personal, do not display. Inside were letters, photos, ticket stubs, Shaq's life before the world turned him into a name. Among the cluttered nostalgia was a small, cream-colored envelope, yellowing at the edges, its corners curled like tired leaves. There was no return address, just his name, scrawled in Jenna Caldwell's elegant handwriting. Postmarked, November. "Shaq," Lennox had said, holding it up like something sacred. "This one's never been opened." Shaq had stared at the envelope, blinking as if it were a hallucination. He remembered the year, the fog of success he was in then. Championship runs, commercials, fast cars, fast days. That envelope must have been buried in the chaos, overlooked, or maybe, a part of him had never wanted to see it. Now seated alone in his den, the letter lay on the table between his palms. He didn't rush to open it. He stared at it the way you stare at a doorway that leads somewhere you can't come back from. When he finally peeled it open, the paper inside was soft, fragile from time. Jenna's handwriting danced across the page in smooth, slanted lines. "Shaquille. By the time you read this, if you ever do, I'll be gone. Not in the dramatic sense. Just absent, hidden from view. Our paths weren't meant to walk the same roads. I knew that before we ever kissed. But I couldn't let you carry the weight of a life you didn't ask for. I've made a decision, and I pray every day that you don't hate me for it. Her name is Avery. She's yours." Shaq's hands went still. The air thickened. His throat tightened. But he kept reading. "I know what your world demands, what it expects of you. I couldn't raise her in the spotlight, in the shadow of your greatness. I couldn't raise her where cameras would chase her first steps, or where the headlines would write stories before she ever learned her own name. So I left. I ran. I chose a quiet life over a public one, and I chose to keep her safe from it all. That might make me wrong. Maybe it does. But I loved you. And in some strange way, I thought protecting her from you was a way of protecting her for you. If this letter ever reaches you, please forgive me. I wanted to tell you in person. I wanted you to hold her. But some things grow heavier with time, and I didn't know how to carry them to your door. Take care of yourself. Maybe one day you'll meet her, and she'll know you the way I did. Before the world did. Jenna. The silence in the room was unbearable. Shaq sat motionless, letter in hand, as if letting it go would make the truth vanish. For years he'd told himself that Jenna leaving was just another chapter closed without explanation. He never imagined there was more, never imagined he'd been a father all this time without even the ache of knowing what he'd lost. He rose, pacing slowly, the letter trembling in his fingers. How do you grieve a life you didn't know you missed? He thought of Avery, the woman in the video. Her voice, her composure, her resemblance. She had grown up without his name, without his shadow, without a father, and he had been here, living quietly, not knowing she existed. Regret came first, then rage. Not at Jenna, he understood why she'd done it. Not at Lennox, not even at himself. Just a deep, marrow-level fury that life had allowed something so essential to pass him by unnoticed. He returned to the table, sat down and read the letter again. Not for clarity, he understood every word, but because he needed to memorize it. Every loop of ink, every crossed T, every choice Jenna had made without him. Lennox stepped into the room, careful not to disturb the silence. She really never told you? He asked quietly. Shaq shook his head. Not a word. And the name Avery. It's her. His voice was certain now, no longer cracking. What do you want to do? Shaq didn't answer right away. He looked out the window past the trees and long grass. His ranch was peaceful. Sure, but peace meant nothing now, if it had been built on a silence that cost him a daughter. I want to find her, he said finally. But not like I'm chasing headlines. She's already been humiliated once this week. I won't let my legacy be the next thing that breaks her. Lennox nodded. Quiet search. Off the grid. I'll contact Delilah. Shaq smiled faintly at the name. Delilah Cortez had been a sports journalist in the early 2000s, but traded media fame for investigative consulting. She didn't deal in gossip, only truth. If anyone could find Avery without lighting a fuse, it was her. As Lennox moved to make the call, Shaq walked to the back porch, the letter still in his hand, folded gently now. The sun had shifted, painting the landscape in amber. He stared at the sky, memory bleeding into the present. He remembered the first time he saw Jenna standing on the steps of a Harlem brownstone, arguing with a landlord about rent increases and tenant rights. She wasn't afraid to speak, and she wasn't afraid to leave. That's what he'd loved about her. He thought of all the father-daughter dances he'd missed, the birthdays, the scraped knees, the college acceptance letters, the heartbreaks, all the chances he might have had to be something, anything, more than a stranger she'd never named. Now he wasn't sure what he could be to her, but he knew one thing. He couldn't be nothing anymore. He looked down at the letter again. Avery's name was inked into the folds of this forgotten paper, but it was already burning through the walls of his past. She didn't know it yet, but a storm was gathering behind her, not to destroy, but to fight for her. And maybe, just maybe, repair the silence that Jenna had left behind. The lake didn't offer answers, but it did offer silence, the kind that pressed gently on the skin and seeped into the bones. Avery sat on a narrow wooden bench near the water's edge, still dressed in the same blazer and heels she'd worn to the salon days earlier. The memory of that moment still curling in the corners of her mind like smoke. The trees rustled, and the breeze carried the clean scent of pine and something distant. Maybe rain. She hadn't cried yet. It was strange. The humiliation had hit hard and fast, but so had the numbness that followed. There was something deeper under it all. A question she couldn't name but couldn't shake either. Her wedding was 7 weeks away, yet everything felt fractured now. Not because of the dress, not even because of the boutique's cruelty. It was something else, a sense that her identity had been peeled away in layers. Like bark stripped from a tree, she'd spent her whole life believing that who she was had been built on strength, independence and truth, but lately that truth had started to feel thinner, like she'd inherited a story missing its beginning. The surface of the lake was still, reflecting the clouds and the shape of her thoughts. She whispered, "What are you not telling me, Mom?" It was a question she'd asked in her head since she was a teenager. Now it felt heavier than ever. Her mother, Jenna, had always dodged questions about her father, not out of spite, but in a practiced, graceful way that made it clear the subject was off limits. She'd once said, "Some truths don't keep you warm, baby, they just keep you up at night." Avery hadn't pressed her again. Now she wished she had. Miles away, in a quiet Atlanta apartment, stacked with research binders and clippings from decades past, Delilah Cortez lit a cigarette she didn't intend to smoke, and stared at the printout on her desk, a still shot from a bridal salon video. Avery, mid-step, mid-leave, unknowingly historic. The picture looked like something from a modern painting, dignity wrapped in discomfort. Across from her, Shaq sat in silence. He hadn't touched the coffee she'd poured. He hadn't said much beyond the essentials. It was his eyes focused, locked, the same eyes Delilah remembered from their first conversation in 2001, when she was interviewing him post-game, and he asked her the questions instead. He was older now, broader somehow, not in muscle but in soul. Fame had weathered him. Regret had reshaped him. "I need to find her," Shaq said again, more to the air than to her. Not as a headline. As her father. Delilah tapped ash into a tray, her tone calm but edged. "You don't know how she's going to take this. She's a grown woman, built her whole identity without you in it." "I know that," he replied, "but I don't want to die with that silence between us. I can't." Delilah leaned back. "If you're wrong, if she's not yours, she is. You're betting this whole thing on a gut feeling and a letter from..." Shaq didn't blink. "My gut hasn't failed me on people. Not once." Delilah sighed, then opened a slim manila folder. "Her name's Avery Caldwell. Works in nonprofit advocacy, housing and urban reform. Raised by her mom, who passed in 2013. No siblings, quiet record. Clean, graduated Howard with honors. Fiancé is Kellen Marchin. Real estate tech money. The usual disruptor type." Shaq's eyebrows lifted faintly. "He'd treat her right." Delilah hesitated. "Depends how you define right. No criminal record. But he's curated. His social presence is all optics. PR polished. No signs of physical harm. But something feels off. His control's more subtle, image-driven." Shaq clenched his jaw. "I don't like the sound of that."
"That's not the only thing you won't like," she added, sliding another file across the table. "He's not the only one watching her. Roland Vex is back in town."
That name hit like a thud. Shaq looked up slowly. "Vex?" Delilah nodded. "He caught wind of your interest in Avery, and he's worried. You bring her into the public eye, especially if she's tied to you, and his past decisions start unraveling." Roland Vex had once been a rising sports exec with a spotless image and dirty hands. He and Shaq had clashed during contract years, clashed harder when Vex tried to get in Jenna Caldwell's ear decades ago, suggesting she move on from distractions. Shaq had kept quiet back then to avoid blowing up Jenna's life. But Vex hadn't forgotten, especially not if a secret child could rewrite his history. "Why would Vex care now?" Shaq asked. "Because Jenna worked briefly at Vex's firm in '96 Legal Affairs. If word gets out that he knew she was pregnant with your child, and helped bury it to preserve his asset, it's over for him. There's too much legacy riding on that silence." Shaq leaned forward. "You think he'll go after her?" "Not physically. He's not a thug. But reputation? Records? He'll erase her if he has to. Smear her online. Turn her into a scandal before she even knows the game she's in." Shaq's knuckles tightened on the edge of the table. "Then we move faster." Delilah raised a hand. "Slow and strategic. You bulldoze into her life. You could traumatize her worse than the boutique did." "She's already been through worse," he said quietly. "She doesn't know who you are, Shaq." He paused. "Neither did I." Back at the lake, Avery opened her planner. The wedding seating chart stared back at her. Empty names and tables that felt pointless now. She started crossing out guests. First those she didn't know well, then those she'd invited to please Kellen's image. By the time she closed the folder, half the list was gone. Her phone buzzed. It was Kellen. Again. She ignored it. She stared back at the water and saw not her reflection, but something clouded, shifting. Her mother's voice again. "Some truths don't keep you warm." She didn't know it yet, but her truth was moving toward her. A truth in size 22 shoes, and a voice that once echoed across arenas. A truth shaped like the man the world called Big Shaq, and the father she never knew she needed. And while one man searched to reclaim a daughter he'd never held, another lurked in boardrooms and quiet meetings, whispering warnings to publicists and lawyers. Roland Vex was preparing his own move, one born not from love, but fear. Because if Avery Caldwell was revealed as Shaquille O'Neal's daughter, the stories he'd helped bury might claw back to the surface and drag his empire down with them. The mist hung over the lake like a veil, as if the truth itself was waiting to be unveiled. The sun draped itself over the city like a promise that couldn't be kept. Atlanta was bustling that afternoon, but the quiet brick building nestled in the heart of West End carried its own tempo, a slower, more deliberate rhythm. It wasn't grand or flashy, no tall gates, no polished signs, just a hand-painted board outside that read, "The Haven Project. Empowerment through Equity." The nonprofit center had become a refuge for voices often unheard, and today it was hosting a guest speaker, an icon the volunteers hadn't been told much about, just that he was well-known, real, and worth listening to. Shaq arrived through the back entrance, flanked by Lennox and Delilah, who kept their distance while he adjusted the gray button-down that barely contained his broad frame. There was no media, no entourage, no announcement of his presence. He didn't want the crowd to look at him. He came to look at someone else. Inside, the hall was simple. Folding chairs, exposed rafters, mismatched floor tiles. Yet it was filled with something stronger than polish. Purpose. And at the front of it, organizing volunteers, rearranging flyers, and joking with two elderly women, stood Avery. Shaq's breath caught in his throat. There she was. The way she moved. Calm, efficient, in command without effort. Her hair pulled back, a small chipped ring on her index finger, the same defiant grace Jenna once had. She was magnetic. Not because she demanded attention, but because she did. He took a seat near the back, not out of fear, but out of respect. He didn't come to interrupt her rhythm. He came to understand it. After the brief welcome and some introductions, the director of the center handed the mic to Avery. "Avery Caldwell. Our heartbeat around here," she said with a warm grin. "She's got something to say about roots, belonging, and the fight for identity. So listen close." Avery stepped up to the small podium, papers in hand, but hardly glancing at them. Her voice was steady at first, professional. She spoke about housing inequities, about how legacy affects opportunity, about the difference between inheritance and access. Then her voice faltered. Just a fraction. She paused. "I used to think I had to earn space in rooms like this," she said quietly. "But if I didn't come from a name, a history, a legacy, I had to build one from scratch. And that's what I did." Shaq leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't know where I come from," she continued. "Not really. My mom, she raised me on love and grit. But she never told me who my father was. Not a name, not a picture, just silence." Her fingers gripped the edges of her notes, and I carried that silence like armor. "But lately I've been asking myself, if you don't know where you come from, how do you know where you belong?" The room was hushed. She let the question hang. "But here's what I've learned," she added, her voice strengthening. "I don't know my lineage, but I know my worth. I don't know who passed me their blood, but I know what I bleed for. Justice, community, truth. I may not come from greatness, but I stand in it." Shaq blinked. Hard. That was him. That was his spirit, his fire, echoed in the voice of a daughter who didn't know she was speaking to her father. She had inherited more than his eyes. She had inherited his soul. When the session ended, volunteers broke into circles. Snacks were served. Laughter sparked in pockets. Shaq stayed seated, waiting for the moment. Eventually, Avery walked by, catching his gaze with polite familiarity. He stood slowly. "Ms. Caldwell," he said with a warm nod. "That was powerful." She smiled. "Thank you. We try to make the space real here." "You make it more than that," he replied. "You make it honest." She looked at him more carefully now. Something in her paused. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" "Not formally. Just someone who cares about the work you're doing." A beat passed. Something unspoken flickered between them. She tilted her head, intrigued but guarded. Then she nodded. "Well, thanks for coming." As she walked away, Shaq stayed rooted. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Every cell in his body wanted to say it, to call her by the name only he had the right to use in a different way. But it wasn't time. Not yet. Later, outside near the front steps, Lennox approached Shaq quietly. You did good. She did better, Shaq murmured. She's a storm. And she doesn't even know it. Delilah joined them moments later, slipping a file into Lennox's hands. Something you should see. About Kellen. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Delilah exhaled slowly. He's been accessing sealed records. Shaq stiffened. What kind of records? Birth archives. Hospital logs. Jenna's legal work. Some under her maiden name. Some tied to old employment agreements. Specifically ones Roland Vex signed. Why? Shaq asked, voice dropping. Delilah's jaw tightened. Because he found out before you did. He's known for weeks that Avery might be yours, and he's been scrubbing it ever since. Shaq's fists clenched. She doesn't know. No, Delilah confirmed. But he does, and he's been keeping her in the dark, not to protect her, to protect his grip. Suspicion churned into purpose. Shaq had felt something off about Kellen since he'd first heard his name. Tech money with a curated charm, more invested in optics than truth. Now it was clear. Kellen wasn't just withholding history. He was erasing it. Shaq looked back at the building. She's standing on sand, and doesn't even know it. Lennox nodded. What's the play? Shaq's voice was low. Solid. We get to the truth before Kellen buries it, and we do it in a way that leaves no cracks. Inside, Avery stared at her reflection in the hallway mirror. For a moment, the image stared back uncertainly. She touched her necklace, her mother's, a piece of a woman who'd given her everything but an origin. She wasn't looking for a father. But something in her chest whispered, he might be looking for you. Kellen Marchand had built his life like a pitch deck, every detail intentional, curated and tailored for impact. He was the kind of man who never left his laptop in sleep mode, who had folders within folders named by date and potential media spin. His social media presence was clean, minimal, but threaded with subtle indicators of status, boats, rare books, vineyards, but never flash. His charm was efficient, his silence calculated, and his engagement to Avery Caldwell was, in his mind, part love, part investment. She grounded him. She softened his image. A black woman with undeniable intelligence and nonprofit credibility, who made Kellen look less like a venture capitalist and more like a visionary. Their story played well. It struck a balance between heart and ambition, but what Kellen hadn't planned for, what he hadn't factored into the algorithm, was the shadow beginning to fall across his stage. That shadow had a name, a legacy, and a past Kellen didn't want exposed. Shaquille O'Neal. The first time Kellen noticed him wasn't in person. It was through security footage from the Haven Project. He had remote access to the system, something he never told Avery, something she never thought to question. He watched the grainy clips on a Wednesday night, glass of bourbon in hand, squinting at the figure seated in the back row of her speaking event. The size was unmistakable. But it wasn't the physical presence that disturbed Kellen. It was the expression. The way Shaq looked at Avery, not as a celebrity, not as a stranger, as something more. Something claimed. Kellen rewound the clip. Again, and again. Then he started digging. At first it was harmless. Just curiosity. A background search on Shaq. Public records. Known associates. Then he looked deeper, into Jenna Caldwell's archived files. Most had been legally sealed, or buried under defunct firms and inactive databases. But Kellen knew how to move in digital shadows. He bypassed permissions, paid quiet tech freelancers to scrape data. And what he found made his skin go cold. Hospital records. A single line entry. Avery Caldwell. Born to Jenna Caldwell. Primary physician Dr. E. Lantham. Cedars-Sinai, Los Angeles. April 9. The father's section was blank. But cross-referencing the date, he found an archived photo in an old sports blog. Shaquille O'Neal, courtside at a Lakers exhibition game. Same week, same city. He didn't need a DNA test. He knew. And he knew what it meant. If Avery found out, everything he'd constructed, the dynamic of their relationship, the influence, the direction of her future could unravel. She would inherit a legacy that didn't include him. She wouldn't need him. Not financially, not emotionally. He would become a footnote. So he made a decision. He scrubbed it. Used a backdoor route through a former hospital IT contact to clean the digital threads linking Avery to Jenna's early files. Then for insurance he updated Avery's cloud password without her knowing, locking down all her scanned childhood records she'd uploaded for safekeeping. He deleted a subfolder titled Mom's Papers. All of it. By the time he was done, the only remaining trace of Jenna's link to Shaq existed in a letter the world didn't know about. And in a man who wasn't going to stop looking. But Kellen wasn't finished. Late one night he placed a call. A number saved but never dialed until now. Roland Vex answered on the third ring. His voice was the same as Kellen remembered. Dry, detached, precise. "I figured you'd call," Vex said. No greeting. "I need a firewall," Kellen replied. There was a pause. "She's beginning to ask questions?" "She's being asked questions." Shaquille O'Neal showed up at her nonprofit. Quiet, but not accidental. Vex exhaled slowly. "I told you to manage this early." "I did," Kellen snapped. "I erased what I could. But if he gets to her before we control the narrative, he will rewrite it," Vex finished. "And you'll be a mistake she corrects." Kellen didn't answer. The silence was confirmation enough. "I'll take care of it," Vex continued. "But understand, if this explodes, your name won't be in my mouth. You're a ghost. Stay that way." The line went dead. Back at the ranch, Shaq sat with Delilah and Lennox, watching the puzzle come together piece by piece. Delilah had traced Kellen's day-to-day activity through burner proxies and digital footprints. He wasn't subtle enough. Shaq stood from the table, pacing slowly. He's hiding her identity from her. Not to protect her, but to protect his stake. He's compromised, Delilah agreed. And he's working with Vex, who's still got reach in legacy circles. Shaq turned to Lennox. "Can we intercept before he takes it public?" Lennox nodded. "Yes, but the longer we wait, the more ground we give him. He's playing chess." "Then it's time I flipped the board," Shaq said. But even as Shaq prepared to make his next move, Kellen was already spinning a new story, positioning himself as the anchor in Avery's life. The man who had guided her through identity uncertainty and stood by her during a difficult emotional discovery. He was creating a version of the truth that kept him at the center, regardless of what reality revealed. In Avery, she was still in the dark, still planning a wedding with a man whose love was wrapped in control. Still wondering why certain records of her past were missing. Still believing the silence around her childhood was something sacred. Her mother left untouched, not something someone was actively erasing. But the curtain was thinning. And when it fell, not everyone would survive the spotlight. Delilah didn't knock. She didn't need to. She walked straight through the polished glass doors of Kellen's downtown office like she belonged there, heels clicking across the imported wood floor with a rhythm that dared anyone to stop her. Her presence cut through the air like a blade, clean, cold, deliberate. Kellen looked up from his laptop, composed as ever, but his hand hesitated slightly on the trackpad. "That was enough." "We need to talk," she said. No preamble. "I'm in a meeting." "No, you're in a lie, and you've run out of versions to tell." He exhaled, leaning back in his leather chair, trying to play it calm. "If this is about this is about Avery." Delilah snapped. "You've been manipulating her life, deleting her records, locking her out of the truth that was never yours to control. You think you're protecting her. No, you're protecting your place in her story. But you were never the author." Kellen stood now, jaw tight. "She doesn't need that history. She's better off without it. Do you think finding out who her father is magically fixes anything? It will complicate her life. Destroy her peace. She's happy. With me." Delilah's gaze didn't flinch. "No, she's small. You've kept her that way. Scared to look backward, unsure how to move forward. You didn't give her happiness. You gave her dependency. That ends today." Kellen's silence was brittle. He wasn't fighting her anymore. He was breaking beneath the weight of exposure. "She deserves the truth," she said. Softer now. "Not filtered through your insecurities. From her father." Across the city, Shaq sat in a sunlit corner of the Haven Project's community room, waiting. He had arrived early, alone, without the comfort of Lennox or the protection of fame. On the table in front of him sat a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, the initials J etched faintly into the corner. It was Jenna's. Delilah had uncovered it through a storage facility under an old alias. Jenna Caldwell had been meticulous, but not cruel. She hadn't intended to erase the truth. She just hadn't known how to offer it. When Avery walked in, Shaq stood. Her face was unreadable, guarded, calm, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed the storm beneath. "You wanted to talk," she said. "I came for answers, not apologies." He nodded and gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "I'm not here to give excuses," he said. "Just the truth." "Then start with where you were," she snapped. "Where were you when I cried for a father? When I sat on my bedroom floor and asked my mom why I didn't look like anyone else. When people made jokes and all she gave me was silence. Shaq swallowed hard. I didn't know. Not until weeks ago. That's convenient. It's the truth, he said quietly. I got a letter. A letter Jenna sent in 1997. I never saw it till now. She made a choice to keep you away from all this. My world. The noise. The spotlight. She thought she was protecting you. Avery's laugh was sharp, painful. She thought being invisible was safer than being seen. She passed that fear to me like an heirloom. Shaq reached down and picked up the journal, offering it carefully. This was hers. She kept it all these years. It's not an answer. But it's hers. And it's yours. Avery took it with hesitation. The leather was warm from the sun. She opened to a marked page. He never abandoned you. I did. I did it with good intentions. I did it with tears. But it was still me, not him. I left the door closed and never told him where to knock. If one day you find this, know that I chose silence, but he never did. Her hands trembled slightly. She flipped through more pages, photographs taped inside, notes in margins, mentions of Avery's first words, first fever, a drawing of a baby wrapped in a Lakers onesie. I didn't get to hold you, Shaq said, his voice low. Didn't get to teach you how to ride a bike. Didn't get to walk you to school. And I will carry that, always. Avery looked up at him. Her walls hadn't dropped, but they cracked just enough. I don't know what to do with this, she whispered. It doesn't make anything simple. I don't want simple, he replied. I just want real, even if it's messy. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The journal lay open between them, like a bridge under construction, fragile, but possible. Then her phone buzzed. Again. Then again. Dozens of notifications lighting up the screen. She frowned, pulled it from her coat, and her expression shifted to horror.
News alerts.
Trending tags. Article. Bridal boutique discrimination leads to shocking discovery. Shaquille O'Neal's secret daughter. From humiliation to heritage. The woman behind the viral video. Legacy rewritten. NBA legend and the daughter he never knew. Photos of her. Of the boutique. Of Shaq. Of Jenna Caldwell. Lifted from an old college yearbook. Avery stared at him. Did you do this? Shaq shook his head, alarmed. No. I swear. I was trying to keep this between us. Delilah's voice buzzed through Shaq's phone a moment later. It's Vex. He leaked it. Had Kellen plant it with a freelance blogger to beat us to the punch. It's everywhere now. Avery's chest rose and fell rapidly. He knew? Kellen knew and didn't tell me? Shaq nodded slowly. He knew. And he tried to erase you before anyone else could find you. Tears welled in her eyes, but didn't fall. Not yet. I trusted him, she said softly. I let him into my future. Shaq stepped forward, careful. That future's still yours. No one gets to steal it. Not Kellen. Not Vex. Not even me. She looked at him then. Truly looked. Not as a stranger. Not as a celebrity. But as a man trying to piece together something broken before it was ever whole. I don't know how to be your daughter, she said, voice cracking. Shaq's voice was a whisper. Then let's learn together. The room felt heavy, but not hopeless. The weight of years lost couldn't be lifted in a single afternoon, but the silence between them had broken, and that was enough for now. As Avery left the building that day, her phone still buzzing with headlines, she ignored every call, every ping, every alert, except one. She scrolled through her mother's journal until she found a passage underlined twice. Truth hurts less than secrets. In the end, she clutched the book to her chest. And for the first time in her life, Avery knew the truth had a name. The headlines didn't fade. They multiplied, metastasized. Newsrooms fed the beast hour by hour, spinning every frame of Avery's story into spectacle. Daughter of NBA legend. Exposes elite boutique discrimination. Shaq's secret child or opportunist. Who is Avery Caldwell? Really? The headlines blurred the truth, boiled it down to marketable tension, scandal, legacy, and identity on trial in the court of public opinion. But behind the media's machine, something far more insidious was moving, crafted with precision by Roland Vex. It started subtly. Anonymous quotes planted in niche blogs, insiders alleging Avery had orchestrated the salon incident for attention. Then came whispers about forged connections, altered records, and the absurd suggestion that Jenna Caldwell had fabricated a relationship with Shaq to chase proximity to power. Vex made no direct statement, but his fingerprints were all over the campaign. His playbook had always been the same: sow doubt, discredit quietly, control the narrative before truth can catch up. Avery watched it unfold like wildfire. Her inbox flooded with threats and support in equal measure. Strangers demanded DNA proof. Media trucks began parking near her nonprofit's headquarters. Speaking engagements were canceled to avoid controversy. Her own board issued a gentle suspension pending clarity. Even some of her closest colleagues went quiet. She sat on her apartment floor one night, knees hugged to her chest, phone face down beside her. Kellen was long gone, his silence proof enough of his guilt. Her world was no longer cracking. It was caving. But when the world caves, you find out what your voice is made of. Shaq visited that night without cameras or fanfare. Just him, in a plain hoodie, with 2 coffees and the same quiet strength she now realized was written into her DNA. He didn't say anything when she opened the door, just handed her the drink. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were rimmed in red, but dry. Her spine was straight. "They're coming for me," she said softly, as she shut the door behind him. Shaq sat across from her at the small kitchen table. "They're scared of you." "Why?" "Because you remind them that stories don't belong to the ones who bury them. They belong to the ones who rise from them." Avery stared at the blank wall for a long time. "I'm not ready for this," she said. "No one is. But the truth doesn't wait for readiness." She opened her laptop and pulled up the news cycle. More headlines, now with doctored photos of her in luxury gowns, proving she sought fame. One piece showed a clip of her nonprofit's finances, misrepresented to look like fraud. "I've built everything I have," she said through clenched teeth. "They're trying to make me into a thief. They're trying to turn a threat into a punchline." She looked at him. "I want to speak, not to defend myself, to reclaim myself." Shaq leaned back, smile faint. "Then speak. I've got you." The press conference was called for the following morning. A single podium was set up outside the Haven Project. No stage, no red carpet, just sunlight, bricks, and truth. Cameras lined the curb like vultures. Networks desperate for the next soundbite. Reporters shouted questions before the mic even turned on. And then Avery stepped into view. No stylist, no security detail. Just her. Hair tied back, blazer sharp, eyes clear. Shaq stood in the background, beside Delilah, both silent, both immovable. Avery took a breath, adjusted the mic, and began. "I'm not here to explain myself. I'm here to remind you that some stories write themselves in silence, and some are ripped open by force." The murmurs stilled. "My mother raised me with integrity, not influence. She gave me values, not connections. She didn't tell me who my father was, not to hide it from me, but to protect me from a world that assigns worth based on last names and net worths." She glanced at the cameras, voice growing firmer. "I didn't seek fame. I didn't seek a spotlight. I sought a wedding dress. And for that I was humiliated, judged, erased." A reporter shouted, "Are you claiming to be Shaquille O'Neal's daughter?" She didn't flinch. "I'm not claiming anything. I am Avery Caldwell. I have the blood of Jenna Caldwell in my veins, a woman of fire and grace. And yes, I carry the legacy of a man who never got the chance to hold me. But I was not made by his fame. I was made by the silence between us and by the strength it took to break it." She paused, eyes narrowing. "To those who tried to bury my truth, those who scrubbed records, paid bloggers, and built campaigns to reduce me to a headline, you tried to erase me. You didn't know I was unerasable." The crowd froze. The moment stretched. Shaq, watching from behind, closed his eyes for half a second, a quiet breath escaping his lips. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper. Recognition. Avery finished with quiet authority. "I don't need the world to validate my identity. I am not a question mark in someone else's narrative. I am the period, the end of speculation, the beginning of truth." She stepped back. No questions, no dramatics, just truth, laid bare. The backlash against Vex was instant. Screenshots of altered emails surfaced. A former PR assistant came forward, detailing instructions to plant false stories. Media outlets issued corrections. A documentary producer contacted Avery within hours, but she declined. Maison Loon's boycott gained national traction. Within days, the boutique closed its doors for restructuring. But Avery wasn't chasing revenge. She went back to the Haven Project. She reopened programs paused during the scandal. She wrote a letter to the board, not begging, but asserting. They reinstated her within 72 hours. In a quiet moment weeks later, Shaq sat beside her again. "This wasn't about a dress," he said. "No," Avery replied. "It was about a door the world thought I couldn't walk through." He nodded. It wasn't just about her dress. It was about the world telling her she didn't belong. She smiled faintly, and the world was wrong. The doors of Maison Lune gleamed with fresh polish, but they no longer reflected exclusivity. They reflected transformation. The once untouchable sanctuary of couture and coded rejection now pulsed with a different energy, softer yet stronger, stripped of pretense and made whole by purpose. A new gold plaque at the entrance shimmered subtly in the early afternoon sun. Maison Lune reimagined for every bride. It had been 5 months since Avery Caldwell walked out of these very doors, in silence and humiliation. Now she walked back in, shoulders back, gaze forward, her presence echoing louder than any apology could. The boutique had changed hands swiftly after the scandal. The original owners had sold off their stake under public pressure and loss of clientele. A private collective of Black women entrepreneurs had purchased the property, stylists, designers, cultural curators, and had extended an invitation to Avery, not out of pity, but out of respect. They wanted her not as a figurehead, but as a voice, a compass and a force. Her new title was simple yet potent: Consulting Director of Inclusivity and Design. It wasn't just honorary. It came with real input, real decisions, and real accountability. Avery didn't want to be symbolic. She wanted to be instrumental. Today was the soft relaunch. No press, no cameras, just a quiet reopening for internal staff, selected clients, and community members who had stood by the movement, sparked by one woman, one moment, and one mirror. She stepped through the front entrance. This time, no one asked for her name. The reception desk had been redesigned, the once sterile white counter replaced by warm wood, with etched patterns inspired by African diasporic textile work. Framed portraits now lined the walls: women of color, indigenous women, plus-sized brides, brides with locks, vitiligo, scars, real brides, real stories. Avery's heels moved across the marble floor. Not with caution, but with intent. Staff members greeted her not with scripted smiles, but with reverent nods and knowing glances. They had seen her journey. They knew the weight she carried in her name, and the ones she carried in her silence. In her palm she clutched a small silver pendant. It hung from a thin chain around her neck, just visible above her blouse. It was a replica of her father's high school jersey number. He'd gifted it to her quietly, weeks after the press conference, with no fanfare. Just a note that read, "You carry this better than I ever did." She wore it not as a statement, but as a promise. In the design studio, swatches lined the walls in every hue imaginable. Gone were the shades labeled only nude, or blush that catered to a narrow vision of beauty. In their place were deep ambers, honey browns, cool olives, and berry reds, colors that honored a full spectrum of skin tones and heritage. A seamstress greeted her with a tape measure draped over her shoulder, her locks pinned in a tight bun. "Director Caldwell," she said warmly, "we just finished the embroidery mock-up for the Liberation gown. Want to see?" Avery smiled. "Please." The gown stood on a mannequin, beneath natural light. It was regal yet restrained, modern yet ancestral. Flowing silk, draped from the waist in a spiral design, symbolizing unbroken lineage. The lace bodice bore hidden names, embroidered beneath the trim: Jenna, Maya, Audrey, Tony, Harriet. Women who had paved roads in silence, in protest, in pain. Avery reached out and ran her fingers across the fabric. This was more than fashion. This was a reclamation of space. This was healing stitched thread by thread. Outside, across the street and shaded by a row of trees, Shaq stood watching. He didn't step inside. This wasn't his moment. It belonged to her. His presence was quiet, as it had often been since their truth became public. He didn't hover. He didn't advise unless asked. But he always showed up. From that distance he could see her laugh with the staff, move with the authority of someone who wasn't handed power but earned it through fire. She looked nothing like the woman in the viral video months before. She looked more. Delilah joined him under the shade, handing him a coffee. "You gonna say something today?" she asked. He shook his head. "She doesn't need my voice." Delilah studied him. You ever think about how different her life would have been if that letter reached you back then? All the time, he said. Regret? Sometimes, he admitted. But mostly I think about how she became this without me. That's not failure. That's proof. They stood in silence as Avery emerged briefly from the salon, clipboard in hand, phone pressed to her ear, giving instructions with calm precision. She wore the pendant like it had always belonged on her. She glanced once in their direction, sensing a presence, and smiled faintly, then returned to her task. Back inside, the final walkthrough continued. There were notes to be made, policies to refine. She moved through the space as a leader, not a guest. She wasn't reliving a moment, she was rewriting the architecture of it. And when the soft launch concluded, and the staff gathered for a quiet toast in the back, Avery stood at the center. She raised her glass, not high, just steady, to every woman who's ever been told she didn't belong in a place built to celebrate her. The room exhaled together, into the doors we walk through, on our terms. Glasses clinked. Outside, the sun dipped slightly, casting a warm shadow across the boutique's name. Maison Lune had once belonged to a world that filtered its love through elitism. Now it belonged to those who loved without conditions. The air that morning wasn't just warm, it was full of sun, full of meaning, full of something that felt like destiny finally unfolding in its own time. The trees swayed gently along the edge of the garden, and every leaf looked like it had been told to show up and bear witness. There were no cathedrals, no ballrooms, just a long path paved with hand-laid bricks and lined with flowers, grown in the community. Avery had fought so long to serve. She had chosen this spot, the Harmony Garden, because it wasn't built for grandeur. It was built for growth. It had been abandoned once, just like parts of her story. But she'd helped revive it with Cairo, long before anything romantic had ever stirred between them. He had stood beside her during fundraisers and protests, and late-night strategy calls, and one day, as they huddled beneath the small greenhouse roof during a rainstorm, she looked at him and saw, not just a friend but home. The guests were already seated, family by heart, if not by blood. Former students from the Haven Project, the new Maison Lune, partners, her nonprofit's board members, and women who'd stood by her when the world tried to rewrite her. No lavish decor, just real people. People who knew who she was, even when she hadn't known herself. Shaq stood at the back of the garden, hands folded in front of him. He looked out over the rows of chairs, nodding quietly to those who nodded at him with eyes full of recognition, not the celebrity kind, but the human kind. He wore a charcoal gray suit, understated and perfect. His tie was navy, a nod to Jenna's favorite color. Around his wrist, a thin braided bracelet that Avery had made for him just weeks after she'd let him back in. For real. There were no ushers, no ring bearers, no procession rehearsed for drama, just music. A soft, soulful instrumental version of Nina Simone's Feeling Good. And then, Avery appeared. The dress was nothing like the one she once imagined buying behind closed doors. It wasn't from a luxury rack or custom haute couture. It was crafted by local designers, who knew her story and had sewn each detail with purpose. The bodice was fitted, with subtle embroidery echoing her mother's handwriting, taken from her journal. The skirt moved like a river, free, full, and unapologetically present. And from her neck, just below the curve of her collarbone, still hung the pendant. Shaq met her at the start of the path. For a second, neither moved. "You good?" he asked softly. Avery exhaled. "I'm more than good." They walked slowly. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. His presence had become his language. He wasn't performing fatherhood. He was embodying it, quietly, without asking for forgiveness, but walking beside her as if he always had. Cairo stood at the altar in a cream suit. No tie, curls loosely tied back. His smile was steady, but the emotion behind it made his throat tighten as Avery drew near. He had never imagined this moment would belong to him. He had only ever dreamed that she would belong wholly to herself. Anything beyond that was grace. When Shaq reached the end of the aisle, he turned to Avery, kissed her cheek, and placed her hand into Cairo's without words. Then he stepped back, found his seat beside Delilah, and sat. The ceremony was led by a woman from their community, Miss Loretta, nearly 80, who'd mentored both Avery and Cairo since they were teens. Her voice was gravel and honey, worn and warm. She didn't recite from a script. She spoke from memory, blessing their journey, honoring the mothers not present, and naming the ancestors watching. And then came the vows. Cairo went first. I knew you before you knew your roots. And I never needed you to change. I just wanted to be the place where you could grow without fear. I've watched you rise, bend, break, and rise again. And if you'll let me, I'll keep showing up for the next chapter, and the one after that. Every smiled through tears that didn't fall. Not yet. Her vow was soft, almost a whisper. I built walls, not because I wanted to, but because the world taught me that being strong meant being alone. But you didn't try to break them down. You planted flowers outside them. You waited. You believed. You saw me not as broken but as whole. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. With you I'm not surviving. I'm living. There were no fireworks. No grand musical swell. Just two people who had walked through storms and come out whole. Miss Loretta pronounced them married, and Cairo pulled Avery close. Not in triumph, but in reverence. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was deep, layered. It was the sound of a community healing through joy. As the celebration unfolded under golden light and soft jazz, Avery pulled Shaq aside near the old greenhouse. They stood in quiet for a long time. You didn't have to show up like you did, she said. I did, he replied. It was never about making up for the past. It was about not missing another moment. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. It took him a second. Then it hit. His eyes widened. You... She nodded, a small glowing smile forming. Shaq's voice caught. You're gonna be a mom. She looked up at him, nodding again. And I want our child to know the truth. Not just the hard parts, but the beauty that bloomed after. Shaq wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, unable to stop smiling. What's the plan? I'm building something, she said. A scholarship fund. In Jenna's name. For girls like me. Girls who were told they didn't belong in spaces that should have been theirs. Shaq's heart swelled. You're creating legacy. No, Avery said. I'm honoring it. As the sun dipped low and the garden lights began to glow, a narrator's voice drifted in. Shaq's reflecting not as a man of legend, but as a father who found truth in humility. The world tried to define her by the door they shut. She showed them she was the building. And beneath the stars, while laughter floated through the garden, and a baby's future heartbeat pulsed inside a woman the world had once tried to erase, a new chapter began, one not written by legacy, but by love. If you've ever been told you didn't belong, build the room, name the walls, and open the damn door. Every story isn't a moment, it's a mirror. And some reflections demand we do more than just watch. Speak her name, share her power. Remember, silence protects comfort, truth protects legacy. So the next time someone questions your worth, hand them your story unapologetically.